Look up, way up at those soaring vaulted ceilings, those impossibly delicate stained glass windows, those stone spires that seem to pierce the sky itself. For centuries, these cathedrals have stood as monuments to faith, to artistry, to human ambition. But here's the unsettling truth. While we remember the saints and kings associated with these buildings, the names of the architects, the true visionaries who turned dreams into stone, have vanished into the shadows of history. These were the master builders who defied gravity, who solved engineering puzzles we'd struggle with even today, who orchestrated armies of craftsmen across generations. Yet their stories erased until now. Picture this, a 13th century workshop lit by flickering candlelight. A weathered hand sketches plans so revolutionary, they'll change architecture forever. No cranes, no computers, just sheer ingenuity. These forgotten architects didn't just construct buildings, they encoded secrets into the very fabric of their designs. Hidden symbols in the stonework, mathematical riddles in the floor plans, even covert nods to rival guilds or suppressed beliefs. Why? Because their legacy wasn't just about reaching heaven, it was about leaving messages for those who dare to look closer. So what happened to them? Why did history bury these geniuses while celebrating the rulers who merely funded their work? The answer is a tapestry of power, politics, and the quiet rebellion of art. These cathedrals weren't just houses of worship, they were silent protests, audacious experiments, and love letters to future generations. And today, we're unraveling their mysteries. From the hidden signatures tucked into gargoyles' smiles to the groundbreaking techniques that still baffle engineers, this is the untold story of the minds behind the stones. Their brilliance echoes through the ages. It's time we listened. The transition from Romanesque to Gothic architecture wasn't just a stylistic change, it was a daring leap into the unknown. Imagine standing in a 12th century church where thick walls and small windows created dim, fortress-like spaces. Then, seemingly overnight, stone began to defy logic. Walls dissolved into stained glass, ceilings soared higher than ever thought possible, and sunlight flooded sacred spaces like never before. This was no accident. It was the work of anonymous visionaries who looked at the limitations of their time and said, "What if we could do the impossible?" The secret lay in 3 revolutionary breakthroughs. First, the pointed arch, not just a beautiful shape, but a stroke of engineering genius. Unlike rounded Romanesque arches that pushed weight outward, these sharp angles channeled forces downward, allowing walls to grow taller and thinner. Then came the ribbed vault, an intricate skeleton of stone that distributed weight like a spiderweb, turning ceilings into canvases for breathtaking frescoes. But the real game changer, the flying buttress, picture stone arms reaching out from the cathedral's sides like an embrace, catching the outward thrust of those towering walls. These stone crutches were so controversial that some clergy called them ugly necessities until they saw the light-filled sanctuaries they made possible. Who were the minds behind these innovations? Here's the tragic irony. We know the names of bishops and patrons who commissioned these cathedrals, but not the master builders who risked everything to reinvent architecture. Some clues remain hidden in plain sight. At Chartres Cathedral, a small panel in the stained glass shows craftsmen at work, a rare nod to the forgotten hands behind the miracle. In Strasbourg, sketches etched into medieval workshop walls reveal trial and error calculations that would make modern engineers wince. These weren't just builders following blueprints, they were scientists conducting centuries-long experiments in stone. What's most astonishing isn't just their technical prowess, but their willingness to fail. Early Gothic attempts sometimes collapsed, like the choir at Beauvais, which reached too high too fast. But with each disaster came refinement. The anonymous architects shared knowledge across Europe through guild networks, passing down hard-won lessons like sacred texts. By the time Notre Dame rose in Paris, their techniques had transformed construction from guesswork into something resembling precise physics. Yet for all their achievements, history reduced them to ghosts in their own cathedrals. Their signatures erased, their methods called God's will rather than human genius. Perhaps that's the most Gothic twist of all. These architects built monuments to heavenly glory, but in doing so, they left something even more enduring. A testament to what humans can achieve when we dare to reach beyond what's expected when we turn "that's impossible" into "watch this." Their names may be lost, but every time sunlight streams through a rose window or a vaulted ceiling takes someone's breath away, their legacy speaks louder than any plaque ever could. In an age obsessed with recognition, the anonymity of medieval master builders feels almost radical. These weren't just architects, they were part of something far bigger than themselves. While today's architects stamp their names on skyscrapers, their medieval counterparts often spent decades laboring on cathedrals they knew would outlive them by centuries. The difference: a guild system that valued collective mastery over individual glory. Young apprentices didn't just learn to carve stone, they were initiated into a sacred tradition. Starting as early as 7 years old, boys would spend years mixing mortar, hauling materials, and observing before ever touching a chisel. By their 20s, those who showed promise might become journeymen, traveling between construction sites across Europe like medieval knowledge-sharing networks. Only after creating a masterpiece, often an intricate section of vaulting or sculpture, could they join the elite ranks of master builders. This wasn't education, it was transformation. The irony: their very training ensured their anonymity. Guild rules frequently forbade signing work, viewing cathedrals as offerings to God rather than monuments to human ego. At Lincoln Cathedral, archaeologists found tiny personal marks: a star, a crescent moon etched into hidden stone surfaces. These weren't signatures, but quality control symbols tracking which craftsman carved which block. If a wall collapsed, the guild would know whose work failed. Perfection wasn't about pride, it was about survival. Yet within this collective system, individual genius still flourished. Villard de Honnecourt's sketchbook from the 13th century reveals a mind bursting with innovation, mechanical marvels, architectural experiments, even whimsical doodles of lions and wrestlers. His pages show Gothic architecture wasn't some divinely inspired style, but the product of very human curiosity, the real miracle that such creativity thrived within a system demanding absolute humility. Perhaps that's their greatest lesson. When the master builders of Chartres Cathedral aligned their rose window with the summer solstice light, they weren't just showing off technical skill. They were weaving together astronomy, theology, and artistry into something no single mind could have conceived. Their anonymity wasn't an accident, it was the price of transcendence. In forgetting their names, we remember something far more important: what humanity can achieve when we stop chasing credit and start building cathedrals. These soaring cathedrals may seem like anonymous monuments, but look closer. Hidden in plain sight are the whispers of their creators. High above the nave at Notre Dame de Paris, one particular gargoyle doesn't just leer at the city below. With a twisted grin and tools in hand, it's believed to be a stonemason's self-portrait, his rebel signature cast in stone. This wasn't vanity, it was a dangerous gamble. Guild rules forbade personal marks, yet across Europe, craftsmen risked punishment to leave traces of themselves. At Rheims Cathedral, a tiny stoneworker kneels in prayer within the foliage of a capital, not a saint or noble, but a humble artisan immortalized among the sacred carvings. The most ingenious signatures weren't portraits, but mathematical Easter eggs. The master builder of Chartres encoded his name into the labyrinth's dimensions. Walk its path, and you're literally tracing his hidden calculations. In Burgos Cathedral, compass roses carved into pillars align perfectly only during equinoxes, revealing the architect's obsession with celestial geometry. These weren't just boasts of skill, they were covert cries against oblivion. Imagine spending 30 years perfecting a spire, only to vanish from history like mortar dust in the wind. But some messages were bolder. At Exeter Cathedral, a mischievous corbel shows two monks sharing a jug of wine, a scandalous joke in holy stone. Was this rebellion or relief? The truth lies in the margins. While bishops commissioned cathedrals as testaments to divine glory, the artisans smuggled in humanity carvings of peasants harvesting grapes, musicians mid-song, even a wife scolding her husband. These Marginalia transformed sacred walls into medieval comic strips, proving that even in God's house, the workers never forgot the messy, vibrant world outside. The most poignant mark might be the simplest. In the crypt of Canterbury Cathedral, a single worn step bears grooves from generations of masons sharpening their tools. No name, no face, just the tangible echo of countless hands that built upward until their strength gave out. Their greatest signature wasn't in stone, but in the very air between the arches, the space they dared to create where heaven and earth touch. To the medieval master builder, a cathedral wasn't just a building. It was a prayer carved in numbers, a hymn sung in angles and ratios. Step into the tracing house of a Gothic architect, and you wouldn't see scrolls of decorative sketches. Instead, you'd find compasses scratching perfect circles into oak boards, ropes knotted to sacred measurements, and charcoal lines intersecting like celestial road maps. These weren't mere construction plans, they were mathematical love letters to the divine. Take the humble circle, a shape with no beginning or end, symbolizing God's eternity. At Chartres Cathedral, the labyrinth's 11 concentric paths aren't random. They mirror the 11 stages of spiritual ascent in medieval mysticism. Walk its path, and your feet trace a numerical pilgrimage. Even the cathedral's famed rose windows lock Fibonacci sequences into their stone petals, each layer of tracery growing in proportions found in seashells and sunflower seeds. Nature's code repurposed as heavenly art, the architect's obsession with Pythagorean harmony went deeper than symbolism. At Canterbury, the nave's width multiplied by the square root of 2 gives the exact height of the vault. Coincidence? Hardly. These builders knew that certain ratios created acoustics that made chants resonate like angels' voices. They positioned columns using the golden cut, spacing them so sunlight would strike the altar at precise liturgical hours. Every measurement whispered a secret. That beauty wasn't accidental, but the product of equations scribed into creation itself. Some codes were practical. The so-called Mason Square, hidden in Rheims Cathedral's floor plan, isn't just a geometric curiosity, it's a survival blueprint. By dividing walls into interlocking triangles, architects distributed weight so efficiently that 7 centuries later, their structures still shrug off storms that flatten modern buildings. Other messages were more subversive. In the shadow of church authorities who distrusted mathematics as sorcery, builders smuggled planetary orbits into column capitals and encoded the lunar calendar into staircase spirals. The most poignant math lesson lies in what's missing. Without zero, a concept then considered heretical. these architects performed calculus-level calculations using Roman numerals. At Salisbury Cathedral, the spire's tilt was corrected not with computers but with counterweights determined by abacus and intuition, their greatest equation. Faith plus audacity equals the impossible. When the master of Cologne Cathedral wrote that his towers should rise until the money runs out, he wasn't joking. He'd crunched the numbers and bet his legacy that stone could dance. Today, lasers reveal how these medieval geometers worked with error margins thinner than a coin. Yet perhaps their true genius was recognizing that numbers weren't cold abstractions but the living bones of creation. In aligning their cathedrals with cosmic mathematics, they built bridges between earth and heaven, one sacred ratio at a time. Consider the sheer audacity of raising a 200-foot stone vault with nothing but hemp ropes and wooden beams. No steel reinforcements, no hydraulic lifts, just physics mastered through trial and error. The scaffolding alone was a feat of temporary architecture, towering lattices of oak lashed together with ropes that groaned under the weight of stone blocks hauled skyward by treadwheel cranes. These massive human-powered wheels, turned by workers walking inside like hamsters in a wheel, could lift several tons with nothing but leverage and muscle. And when the walls grew too high for cranes, they built the scaffolding taller, sometimes leaving holes in the finished masonry where support beams once stood, ghostly fingerprints of the construction process itself. The real magic lay in the templates. Master builders didn't work from paper blueprints but from full-scale wooden patterns called treasured boards. Imagine tracing every arch, column, and gargoyle onto oak planks, then handing them to stonecutters who'd chisel blindly, trusting that when their pieces reached the construction site hundreds of miles away, they'd snap together like a three-dimensional puzzle. At Wells Cathedral, archaeologists found 13th century templates still bearing tool marks the exact curves needed to create those gravity-defying pointed arches. These weren't just guides, they were the collective memory of a guild system where knowledge was too precious to risk being lost. Wind posed one of the greatest invisible threats. Without modern weather modeling, builders relied on intuition honed through catastrophe. After storms toppled early Gothic experiments, they developed counterintuitive tricks, like deliberately constructing spires slightly off-center to redistribute wind pressure. The flying buttresses at Amiens Cathedral lean at precise angles calculated not with computers but by observing how trees bend in storms, their greatest tool. Patience. When Salisbury Cathedral's spire began tilting, they didn't demolish it. They stacked lead weights on the opposite side and waited 80 years for the settlement to correct itself. What modern engineers find most humbling isn't their technology, but their mindset. Faced with a stone shortage at Beauvais, builders repurposed rubble from collapsed Roman villas, turning broken columns into foundation filler. When transporting massive limestone blocks from quarries, they waited for winter, not for easier travel, but to pour water on the roads, creating icy slides that let stones glide effortlessly on sledges. Every solution was a dialogue with nature rather than a conquest of it. Perhaps their most enduring lesson is in failure. The collapse of choir vaults at Beauvais in 1284 didn't halt Gothic ambition. It became a cautionary tale shared across guild networks. These builders documented disasters not as defeats but as data points. In an age without engineering degrees, each cracked rib vault taught the next generation how to distribute weight more wisely, how to read stress fractures like omens. Their cathedrals weren't built on perfect knowledge, but on the courage to fail upward, one carefully calculated risk at a time. Behind every soaring cathedral spire lies a shadow few acknowledge, the brutal human cost of turning divine visions into stone. While we marvel at these architectural wonders today, the medieval construction site was a battlefield where workers gambled their lives daily. Records from York Minster describe a horrifying incident in 1272 when a section of scaffolding collapsed, sending 12 masons plummeting to their deaths. Their names lost, their families compensated with a single year's wages paid not in coin, but in candles for their graves. Financial ruin loomed as large as physical danger. Master builders often fronted their own money for materials, betting everything on a patron's promise. When the Bishop of Troyes abruptly cancelled his cathedral project in the 13th century, the lead architect, deep in debt from purchasing limestone, was imprisoned for failing to pay his quarrymen. Guild ledgers from Strasbourg reveal even successful projects left builders destitute. One craftsman sold his tools to buy food during a winter when wages froze. The cruelest twist, many never saw their life's work finished. Canterbury Cathedral's master builder, William of Sense, oversaw the nave for 9 back-breaking years, only to suffer a fatal fall from scaffolding in 1178. His replacement, William the Englishman, would spend decades completing what his predecessor began, their shared legacy forever entangled yet rarely remembered together. Political winds could prove deadlier than any accident. When King Philip Roman IV of France seized the Templars' wealth in 1307, the architect of Paris's Sainte-Chapelle, known only as Pierre, vanished mid-construction, likely arrested for his association with the doomed order. At Milan Cathedral, bitter infighting between Italian and German craftsmen led to the lead architect's dismissal after 20 years of service. His revolutionary designs were scrapped, and he died in obscurity while rivals took credit for his work. Even weather became a political weapon. Chronicles from Lincoln tell how a bishop delayed construction for a decade, waiting for his favored architect to recover from illness while an impatient town fumed. The greatest erasure credit itself. Medieval contracts often listed architects merely as the mason or the master, their identities swallowed by the collective guild system. At best, they might appear in church records as Johannes who built the choir, reduced to function rather than genius. When the towering spire of Freiburg Minster was completed in 1330, the city celebrated with a feast. But the master builder's name was left off the guest list. His payment, a lifetime supply of wine, a bittersweet reward for someone who traded decades of his life for stone. Perhaps the most haunting silence comes from the laborers whose bodies literally became part of the architecture. Forensic studies at Durham Cathedral uncovered skeletons buried beneath foundation stones not as sacrifices, but as workers who perished on site and were interred where they fell. Their unmarked graves mirror the fate of their profession, essential yet invisible, supporting unimaginable weight while remaining unseen. The real miracle of these cathedrals isn't that they were built, but that anyone dared to build them at all, knowing full well they might never see the finished work, never hear their names spoken in gratitude, never be remembered as anything more than hands that lifted stones toward heaven. History books would have us believe medieval construction sites were all gruff men and clanging hammers, but parchment records tell a different story. Tucked between the lines of cathedral account books are payments to Isabella the stonecutter and Matilda the glazier, women whose skilled hands shaped sacred stone and glass. At York Minster, a stained glass panel from 1350 shows a woman in a workshop, carefully leading a glass cutting tool. She's not a symbolic figure or saint. She wears the practical apron and rolled sleeves of a working artisan. Some women didn't just contribute labor, they orchestrated entire projects. Take Abbess Bertrada of Chelles in 9th century France, who redesigned her convent's church with an innovative double apse layout that rivaled male architects' work. Or Guda, a 12th century nun whose self-portrait hides in the initials of a manuscript she illuminated, gripping her pen with quiet defiance. These weren't exceptions. Guild records from Cologne to Canterbury list women as full members, inheriting their fathers' or husbands' workshops after plague or war left vacancies. The most powerful female influence often came from patrons rather than builders. Elena of Aquitaine personally funded the Gothic overhaul of Fontevraud Abbey, insisting on revolutionary ribbed vaults for its nuns' choir. In Spain, Queen Berenguela of Castile commissioned Toledo Cathedral's rose window, not as a vanity project, but to encode astronomical knowledge passed down through generations of female scholars. These women navigated a world that denied them formal education, yet they wielded geometry like queens wielding scepters. Why did their stories fade? Partly because medieval chroniclers, almost always male, framed architecture as a masculine pursuit. When women's contributions were recorded, they were often softened into devotional acts rather than technical achievements. A 15th century sketch from Strasbourg shows a rare moment of candor, a master builder consulting with an older woman, likely a guild elder, over architectural plans. Her finger points decisively at a structural flaw while younger male apprentices watch. This image survived not in official archives, but scribbled on the back of a discarded ledger. The greatest silencing came from terminology itself. Contracts referred to the widow who continues her husband's work, rather than naming her as the artisan she was. At Lincoln Cathedral, a series of elegant column capitals bear the distinct style of a carver known only as the Hawthorne Master, until a recent scholar noticed the same motifs in a nearby convent's carvings, attributed to Sister Margaretha. The truth whispers through the stone. Women didn't just assist in medieval architecture, they innovated, directed, and mastered it. Their legacy isn't in signed blueprints, but in the very light filtering through windows they crafted, in the vaults that still stand centuries after their names were erased. Walk into any great Gothic cathedral, and you're not just entering a building, you're stepping into a three-dimensional Bible. Every curve, every column, every shaft of light was meticulously designed to preach without words. Take the cruciform floor plan, that iconic cross shape formed by the nave, transepts, and choir. This wasn't just architectural tradition. It was a visceral reminder that worshippers literally walked the path of Christ's sacrifice as they moved toward the altar. Even the orientation held meaning. Churches universally faced east toward Jerusalem, so dawn light would strike the altar during morning mass, turning ritual into celestial theater. The play of light itself was theology in motion. While Romanesque churches had dim, cave-like interiors symbolizing humanity's separation from God, Gothic architects weaponized sunlight. Their vast stained glass windows transformed ordinary daylight into a kaleidoscope of sacred storytelling. At Chartres, the famous Blue Virgin window doesn't just depict Mary. Its unique cobalt glass, achieved through a then-secret recipe, radiates an otherworldly glow precisely at noon during Marian feast days. This wasn't decoration, it was divine engineering, making the intangible tangibly luminous. Look up at those ribbed vaults soaring overhead, and you're seeing more than structural genius. The interlocking stone ribs form a celestial canopy, mirroring medieval cosmology's belief in the crystalline spheres that carried planets across the heavens. Even the columns below tell a story. Cluster pillars with multiple slender shafts aren't just pretty. They represent the gathering of saints supporting the church, their unified strength making the impossible height possible. Some messages were deliciously subversive. At Lincoln Cathedral, the Bishop's Eye window faces the Dean's Eye. Across the transept, one circular symbolizing eternity, and one quatrefoil representing earthly seasons. Local legend claims this was a not-so-subtle commentary on the constant power struggles between bishops and deans. Meanwhile, Exeter Cathedral's astronomical clock doesn't just tell time. Its intricate gears map the universe according to pre-Copernican beliefs, a frozen snapshot of medieval cosmology that contradicted church doctrine even as it adorned its walls. The most profound symbolism often hid in plain sight. Labyrinths embedded in cathedral floors weren't mere puzzles. They served as spiritual journeys for those who couldn't pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Worshippers would walk these paths on their knees, the physical strain mirroring spiritual struggle. Even the building process itself was a metaphor. Masons intentionally left one stone uncarved during construction, symbolizing that only God's work could ever be truly complete. Perhaps the most poignant message lies in what these architects sacrificed. By designing naves that dwarfed human scale, they made visitors feel microscopic, not to crush spirits, but to elevate them. In a world where most lived in cramped hovels, these soaring spaces gave peasants a taste of infinity, if only for an hour. That was the true miracle of Gothic symbolism, using stone and glass to build bridges between earth and heaven, between human hands and divine dreams. The soaring spires of medieval cathedrals may point heavenward, but their foundations were firmly planted in the messy soil of human ambition. Look beyond the saints and stained glass, and you'll find these sacred spaces were also stages for political theater, economic engines, and cultural battlegrounds. Take the rivalry between Beauvais and Amiens, two French cities locked in a literal race to the sky. When Amiens completed its record-breaking nave in 1260, Beauvais' bishop retaliated by commissioning an even taller choir, bankrupting his diocese in the process. This wasn't just spiritual one-upmanship, it was a medieval arms race where vaulted ceilings replaced siege towers as symbols of power. Wealth flowed through cathedrals like blood through veins. The famous Champagne fairs, Europe's greatest medieval market circuit, timed their dates to coincide with cathedral feast days, ensuring pilgrims doubled as customers. At Canterbury, the shrine of Thomas Becket became such a lucrative tourist attraction that local innkeepers built Europe's first hospitality district around it. The cathedral's miraculous holy water, actually cleverly filtered rainwater, was bottled and sold as far as Norway. Even the building materials told economic stories. Lincoln Cathedral's distinctive greenish stone wasn't chosen for aesthetics. It came from a quarry owned by the bishop's brother, a deal that lined episcopal pockets while justifying the expense as divinely inspired selection. Architecture itself became political propaganda. When French kings consolidated power in the 13th century, their pet architects developed the rayonnant Gothic style, characterized by vast windows filled with fleur-de-lis motifs. These weren't mere decorations, they were stone proclamations of royal authority, visible for miles. Across the Channel, English cathedrals like Wells and Salisbury deliberately used the older, bulkier early Gothic style as a visual rejection of French influence. The message in their thick walls and restrained ornamentation, a defiant statement of English identity during the 100 Years' War. The most fascinating collisions occurred where sacred met profane. At Notre Dame de Paris, the original 12th century design included a spacious upper gallery not for prayer, but for merchants selling wares during church festivals. In Spain, the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela became such a commercial hub that its portico of glory features carved figures of local fishmongers and wine sellers alongside apostles. Even the sacred labyrinth at Chartres served dual purposes during pilgrimages. It became a marketplace where vendors paid the church for prime floor space. Perhaps no cathedral better embodies this earthly entanglement than Venice's Basilica di San Marco. Its exotic domes and golden mosaics weren't just beautiful, they were trophies. Every column, capital, and precious stone was looted from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, making the building both a church and a permanent victory monument. The Venetians went further, embedding stolen classical statues into its walls upside down, a deliberate insult to their defeated rivals. Here, piety and plunder became indistinguishable. These cathedrals stand today as paradoxes, holy spaces built with unholy pragmatism, spiritual aspirations funded by very worldly calculations. Their stones whisper a truth we often overlook, that the road to heaven was paved with taxes, treaties, and the occasional act of architectural espionage. The real miracle isn't that they were built for God, but that through all the human frailty and ambition, they still somehow point us toward something divine. Among the few surviving medieval architectural sketches, the parchment known as the Reims palimpsest tells a particularly haunting story. Discovered hidden beneath later scribblings in the 19th century, this fragile document shows a master builder's frantic redesign of Reims Cathedral's famous facade. The ink is faded, but you can still see where he scraped away earlier lines with a knife, correcting angles as if wrestling with the stone itself. What makes this sketch extraordinary isn't just its rarity, it's the margin notes in Occitan, a regional language banned by the Church. Here, amid geometric calculations, the architect scribbled poetic musings about the weight of heaven and stones that sing. Was he encoding heresy or simply soothing his nerves during a sleepless night? Equally revealing are the so-called tracing floor diagrams, massive full-scale plans scratched into plaster or lead. At York Minster, archaeologists uncovered one such hidden beneath floorboards, a labyrinth of compass arcs and charcoal lines marking every joint of a stained glass window. These weren't reference tools, they were communal canvases where generations of masons added adjustments, their boot prints still visible in the plaster. The real shock came when researchers superimposed the tracing over the actual window. Subtle deviations proved the builders intentionally distorted the design to compensate for how light would refract through colored glass at different times of day. Their blueprints accounted for physics they couldn't yet name. Then there's Villard de Honnecourt's sketchbook, a 13th century Pinterest board of genius. Between precise drawings of Reims flying buttresses, he jotted down everything from mechanical perpetual motion machines to the correct way to sketch a lion based on one he'd seen at the King's Menagerie. His famous mystery leaf shows an intricate geometric construction that modern mathematicians recognize as a fractal pattern centuries before the concept existed. But the most poignant page, a half-finished sketch of Leon Cathedral's towers, abandoned mid-stroke when news arrived that the real towers had collapsed. The ink blots look suspiciously like tear stains. The true Holy Grail, though, may be the Wolfenbüttel scroll, a 33-foot-long strip of sheepskin showing Strasbourg Cathedral's spire in exploded view. Unlike modern blueprints, it mixes precise elevations with cryptic symbols, a crescent moon where stress fractures later appeared, a tiny hammer drawn where hidden iron reinforcements were added. Most intriguing are the void marks, blank spaces labeled "for God to fill." Recent scans revealed these weren't omissions. They matched sections where the master builder allowed craftsmen to improvise within strict geometric boundaries. These fragile pages overturn everything we assumed about medieval design. The builders didn't just work from rigid plans, they thought in 4 dimensions, anticipating how sunlight would age stained glass, how wind would stress stone over centuries, even how future generations might complete their work. Their blueprints weren't instructions, they were living conversations between hands across time. When a storm toppled one of Chartres' towers in 1506, rebuilders didn't consult new drawings, they followed faint charcoal lines on the original tracing floor, left visible by 12th century hands who somehow knew their cathedral would outlast them. That's the real secret these documents whisper. The greatest Gothic cathedrals weren't built on parchment, but in the spaces between the lines, where faith in the future met stone. The Black Death didn't just decimate Europe's population, it left its mark in the very curves of cathedral stone. When the plague emptied workshops in the mid-14th century, a new generation of architects emerged with a radically different vision. Gone were the restrained lines of early Gothic. In their place surged the flame-like tracery of flamboyant Gothic, an architectural scream against mortality. At Rouen Cathedral, the west front's burning, twisting stonework looks almost alive, as if the builders sought to outdance death itself. This wasn't mere decoration, it was stone therapy for traumatized communities. Wars reshaped cathedrals just as profoundly. The 100 Years' War turned churches into fortresses. Note the unusually thick walls at Tours Cathedral, built during English sieges. But conflict also bred innovation. When funding dried up during battles, architects developed austerity Gothic, using painted plaster to mimic expensive stone vaulting at Sens Cathedral. The most poignant wartime adaptation, secret passages like those in Chartres crypt, where townsfolk hid precious manuscripts during invasions, turning sacred architecture into a cultural bunker. Artistic shifts often mirrored societal fractures. The rise of flamboyant Gothic coincided with the Great Schism, when two rival popes split Christendom. Architects responded with dual-towered facades like Strasbourg's, one tower exuberantly ornate, the other soberly plain, stone embodiments of divided loyalties. Even the demons in gargoyles changed character. Post-plague carvings show monsters not just as tempters, but as bringers of specific calamities: famine, locusts, war wolves, even doctor-beaked plague demons. The Reformation forced cathedrals to become shape-shifters. In England, Henry Roman VIII dissolution of monasteries left craftsmen scrambling. Canterbury's masons repurposed stained glass into domestic windows, while at Winchester, Renaissance motifs suddenly appear amid Gothic arches like cultural refugees. Protestant iconoclasts smashed statues, but clever builders preserved them by walling sculptures into hidden niches, as recently discovered at Exeter Cathedral. These weren't acts of defiance so much as architectural triage, saving beauty from ideological storms. Perhaps no era left stranger fingerprints than the Renaissance. When classical ideals swept Europe, Gothic became a dirty word, yet cathedrals stubbornly resisted total makeovers. At Troyes, a bishop ordered Gothic spires lopped off for fashionable domes, only for the next generation to rebuild them even taller. The real hybrid marvel, Seville Cathedral's Giralda Tower, a minaret from the mosque it replaced, capped with a Renaissance belfry, its layers telling Spain's entire religious history in stacked stone. These buildings were never frozen in time. Every scorch mark from Reformation riots, every bullet pock from revolutions, every hastily whitewashed fresco tells of communities wrestling with change. The true genius of medieval architects wasn't just building for their moment. It was creating structures elastic enough to hold centuries of upheaval, yet solid enough to remain standing when the world around them burned. The shadowy allure of secret societies has long draped itself over medieval stonemasons, thanks to centuries of speculation and sensational storytelling. But peel back the layers of myth, and you'll find the reality of these guilds was both more ordinary and more extraordinary than the legends suggest. Yes, masons guarded their techniques fiercely, not as occult secrets, but as trade necessities in an era before patents. The famous mason's marks carved into stones weren't mystical symbols, they were quality control signatures, ensuring each craftsman could be held accountable if his block cracked under pressure. The confusion stems from a timeline mix-up. Freemasonry, as we know it, didn't emerge until the late 16th century, long after most Gothic cathedrals were completed. Medieval guilds were less about secret handshakes and more about standardized wages. A Mason's initiation wasn't a cryptic ritual but a practical exam. Apprentices had to carve a perfect masterpiece, literally, a piece proving mastery under the scrutiny of senior craftsmen. At Strasbourg Cathedral's lodge, records show initiates were tested on geometry problems using only compass and straightedge, skills as vital to their survival as a scalpel is to a surgeon. That's not to say there wasn't real secrecy. Guilds protected trade knowledge like modern corporations guard intellectual property, the formula for the mortar that still binds Chartres Cathedral. Passed down orally to prevent rivals from stealing it. When the architect of Milan Cathedral proposed using iron reinforcements, a radical idea, he was forced to demonstrate the technique behind screens so competitors couldn't copy it. This wasn't mysticism, it was medieval copyright protection. The most persistent myth involves the so-called secrets of sacred geometry. While Masons certainly used complex mathematics, their manuscripts reveal surprisingly pragmatic approaches. The sketchbook of Villard de Honnecourt includes a doodled caption explaining how to estimate a tower's height using a beer stein as a makeshift measuring tool. Their mystical compass designs, often just templates for cutting standardized window tracery faster. Where the Freemason connection holds a kernel of truth is in the guild structure. Medieval stonemason lodges did have hierarchies resembling later fraternal orders: apprentices, journeymen, masters, and their emphasis on moral conduct influenced early Masonic values. But while modern Masons speculate about ancient wisdom, their medieval predecessors were more concerned with mundane matters. Guild records from Canterbury detail heated debates over whether ale or wine made better mortar solvent. Ale won, its sugars helped adhesion. The real secret society wasn't some shadowy cabal. It was the network of traveling master builders who shared innovations across Europe. When a German architect solved a vaulting problem at Cologne, his method appeared months later in Spain through coded workshop songs. These men spoke a lingua franca of compass arcs and load vectors, a language so precise it needed no translation. Their legacy isn't hidden in symbolism, but in the very fact that 800 years later, their stones still stand, not because of magic, but because they mastered the earthbound alchemy of physics, patience, and peer review. Crossing the English Channel in the 13th century wasn't just a journey between nations, it was a leap between architectural universes. While French cathedrals like Notre Dame soared with skeletal grace, their English counterparts like Salisbury stood grounded in muscular solidity. This wasn't just aesthetic preference, it was stone responding to soil, sky, and the stubbornness of local tradition. France's abundance of fine limestone allowed for delicate filigree tracery, but England's unpredictable weather demanded tougher sandstone, leading to broader walls and squatter towers that could shrug off North Sea gales. Material scarcity bred innovation. In Germany's Rhineland, where good building stone was rare, architects pioneered the whole church soaring naves with side aisles of equal height, creating cavernous spaces that needed fewer load-bearing walls. Meanwhile, Spanish builders under Moorish influence fused Gothic ribs with Islamic honeycomb vaulting, as seen in Toledo Cathedral's chapel ceilings, where Christian and Muslim geometries intertwine like old rivals turned dance partners. Local pride shaped silhouettes as much as geology. Italian Gothic, as at Siena Cathedral, kept one foot firmly in Romanesque tradition, with striped marble facades and domes that would make a Florentine blush. The reason: Italian city-states viewed cathedrals as civic crowns, not just spiritual vessels. Why imitate French fashion when you could outshine it with Byzantine glitter? Even the humble brick became a badge of identity in Baltic regions like Sweden, where red brick cathedrals like Uppsala stood as fiery declarations against the grey Scandinavian sky. Some regional quirks were pure problem-solving. English cathedrals like Wells added iconic scissor arches, not as decorative flair, but as desperate reinforcements when the tower began sinking into marshy ground. Over in Prague, the Charles Bridges cathedral-esque towers were deliberately aligned with the sunrise on King Charles's birthday, proving politics could bend even stone to its will. The real mystery isn't why styles differed, but why some tricks didn't travel. France's flying buttresses revolutionized construction, yet Spain largely rejected them, not from ignorance, but because earthquake risks made freestanding walls safer. Likewise, England's love affair with the square East End versus France's rounded apses stemmed from older Saxon church layouts that local congregations refused to abandon. These cathedrals weren't just built for God or glory. They were conversations between ambition and terrain, between celestial dreams and the very earth they rose from. The first light of dawn hadn't yet touched the cathedral's unfinished spires when the master builder's day began. Clutching a wax tablet scribbled with calculations, he'd walk the site before the noise of hammers and chisels drowned out his thoughts. Every stone placement, every scaffold adjustment had to be visualized not just for today, but for how it would bear weight decades later. His workspace wasn't an office, but the tracing floor, a dust-covered room where full-scale plans were scratched into plaster, erased and redrawn as the building evolved. Mistakes here meant cracked vaults or worse collapses that could bankrupt the guild and end careers. Guild rules governed every aspect of work, from the exact width of mortar joints no thicker than a barleycorn to mandatory rest breaks timed by the cathedral's own bells. Apprentice masons spent years mastering just one skill, say, carving foliage capitals before touching anything structural. The strict hierarchy wasn't just about quality control, it was life insurance. When Lincoln Cathedral's tower collapsed in 1239, the Inquisition didn't blame the bishop who demanded its height. They interrogated the junior mason who'd mixed the mortar. Celestial deadlines added another layer of pressure. Bishops insisted critical phases align with holy days, laying the foundation stone on a saint's feast day, completing the choir by Easter. But the stars dictated practicalities too. Quarrying happened in winter when frozen ground eased transport. Mortar mixed in summer dried too fast. The master builder became a meteorologist, studying cloud patterns and consulting almanacs scribbled in the margins of his psalter. Money loomed as large as theology. Patrons often ran out of funds mid-construction, forcing architects to become fundraisers. At York Minster, the master mason designed miniature versions of planned pinnacles to woo donors, medieval crowdfunding prototypes. Wage disputes could halt work for months. Ledger books from Canterbury show masons striking for beer allowances during heat waves. Yet within this rigid system, creativity thrived. The same master builder who painstakingly documented every beam in church records might sneak playful carvings into hidden corners, a fox preaching to geese at Exeter, a mason mooning the bishop at Wells. These weren't just jokes, they were sanity preserved in stone. The real miracle of these cathedrals isn't that they were built, but that human hands, calloused, bruised, and endlessly inventive, could balance celestial dreams with earthly realities, one perfectly placed stone at a time. Every chisel strike on cathedral stone began with a whispered prayer, not to some abstract divine force, but to very specific heavenly patrons. Foremost among them stood St. Thomas the Apostle, the doubting Thomas, who demanded physical proof of Christ's resurrection. Medieval builders saw themselves in his story, men who worked with tangible materials yet wrestled with unseen forces. His feast day on December 21st coincided with the winter solstice, when masons traditionally laid out a cathedral's foundation lines using the year's longest shadows as natural measuring tools. This wasn't coincidence, it was calendar theology, blending sacred time with earthly geometry. Work sites pulsed with ritual. Before laying a cornerstone, master builders would bury relics beneath it, not just saintly bones, but curious sacrifices like eggs, coins, or even the tools of rival guilds. At Wells Cathedral, archaeologists found a worn-out mason's hammer sealed inside a wall, its handle carved with protective runes. The message was clear: every tool, every material had spirit, and ignoring that truth courted disaster. When cracks appeared in vaulting at Beauvais, workers didn't just repair them, they held penitential processions, believing structural flaws mirrored moral ones. The line between faith and fear was thin. Carvers invoked Saint Barbara against sudden death by falling stones, while glaziers prayed to Saint Lucy as they handled molten glass. But some protections verged on spellcraft. Manuscripts from Durham reveal masons anointing their tools with holy water mixed with crushed magnetite, a mineral believed to draw stability into stone. At Chartres, the labyrinth center stone bore faint traces of mercury, likely from some lost ritual to quicken the building's soul. Most telling were the emergency saints. When a vault collapsed at Ely Cathedral in 1322, workers hastily painted Saint Barbara's image on the rubble before daring to rebuild. In Spain, entire construction crews took pilgrimages to Santiago de Compostela after near-fatal accidents, leaving miniature stone models of broken arches as votives. These weren't empty gestures, they were psychological armor against work that routinely killed 1 in 10 craftsmen. Yet for all their devotion, these builders had a pragmatic streak. The same masons who kissed St. Thomas medals before work also kept meticulous ledgers tracking which mortar recipes failed in rain. Their dual ledger books, one for prayers offered, one for materials used, tell the real story. Faith and physics weren't rivals but partners in the dance of creation. Perhaps that's why so many cathedral labyrinths lead not to crosses, but to the empty center. A silent nod to the mystery these builders lived daily, suspended between heaven's ideals and earth's unyielding stone. Flames licked the wooden roof of Chartres Cathedral on the night of June 10, 1194, turning centuries of devotion to ash in hours. But from this devastation rose an architectural revolution. The master builders didn't just reconstruct, they reimagined. Out went flammable timber ceilings, replaced by fireproof stone vaulting so innovative it became the gold standard across Europe. This wasn't mere rebuilding, it was alchemy turning disaster into destiny. Earthquakes posed even deadlier challenges. When tremors shattered Lisbon's cathedral in 1344, Portuguese masons pioneered shock-absorbing techniques still studied today. They embedded flexible cork layers between stones, designed asymmetrical bell towers to dissipate seismic energy, and anchored walls with iron earthquake bars, medieval anti-seismic tech hidden in plain sight. Over in Italy, the architects of Siena Cathedral faced a different threat: unstable clay soil. Their solution, a network of hollow chambers beneath the foundation, an ancient version of modern shock absorbers that redistributed weight during quakes. War left its own scars. The 100 Years' War turned cathedrals into targets, forcing builders to think like military engineers. At Rheims, where French kings were crowned, masons thickened walls and replaced delicate tracery with arrow slit like windows after English bombardment. Some adaptations were subtler, like Canterbury Cathedral's pilgrim stairs, built wide enough to double as escape routes during raids, the most ingenious wartime innovation. Rounded apse ends that deflected siege engine projectiles, a trick borrowed from castle design. But the greatest lesson wasn't in individual fixes, it was in mindset. Medieval architects treated disasters as diagnostic tools. When Lincoln Cathedral's tower collapsed in 1239, the subsequent investigation birthed Europe's first structural engineering report, a parchment now in the British Library detailing exactly which mortar mix failed. At Beauvais, 2 catastrophic collapses led to revolutionary flying buttress designs that spread across France. These builders documented failures with clinical precision, creating guild-wide disaster manuals that read like medieval case studies. Their true genius lay in anticipation. Chartres' post-fire rebuild included hidden attic channels to vent future blazes. Strasbourg's masons angled gargoyles not just for decoration, but to direct rainwater away from vulnerable joints. Even aesthetic choices served structural purposes. The famous bent axis of many Gothic cathedrals, where the nave appears to twist slightly, often a deliberate correction after surveying past foundation shifts. What modern engineers find most humbling is their long-game thinking. When Cologne Cathedral's builders faced flood risks, they didn't just raise the floor, they designed the entire crypt as a sacrificial buffer zone, knowing it would silt up over centuries to become natural elevation. At York Minster, the master mason left coded instructions in the tracing house for future repairs, including a secret compartment with replacement stone samples labeled in Latin, French, and Norse, anticipating language shifts across generations. The ultimate testament to their resilience, these cathedrals still stand today not because they avoided disasters, but because their builders baked adaptability into every stone. They understood what we often forget, that true endurance isn't about resisting change but designing for it. When the next fire, quake, or war came, as they always did, these structures didn't just survive, they evolved. The Black Death didn't just empty villages, it hollowed out the very workshops where Gothic dreams were carved into stone. When the plague swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, it didn't merely kill people, it erased lifetimes of specialized knowledge in months. Master masons who'd spent decades perfecting the art of ribbed vaults, apprentices who could recite the geometric secrets of rose windows, entire guild lineages vanished without passing on their craft. The result, cathedrals mid-construction, like Siena's Grand Duomo, were abruptly simplified. Flamboyant tracery gave way to planar surfaces, intricate pinnacles were replaced by sturdy buttresses, and the soaring heights of earlier designs became cautious elevations. This wasn't just a stylistic shift, it was survival architecture. Look closely at the post-plague additions to Canterbury Cathedral, and you'll spot the telltale signs of a workforce in crisis. The stonework lacks the precision of pre-plague craftsmanship, with joints slightly uneven and carvings less refined. Yet there's a raw honesty to these sections. The masons compensated with ingenious shortcuts, like using standardized templates for multiple windows rather than customizing each one. The plague didn't just reduce their numbers, it forced them to democratize knowledge, breaking down specialized roles into tasks any surviving laborer could manage. The psychological scars ran as deep as the structural changes. Before the plague, Gothic architecture had been about reaching defiantly toward heaven. Afterward, a new humility crept in. The perpendicular Gothic style that emerged in England favored strong vertical lines, less about celestial ambition, more about stability and speed. Parish churches, not cathedrals, became the architectural innovators as communities prioritized pragmatism over grandeur. The fan vaults of Gloucester Abbey, built by a decimated workforce, show this shift beautifully. Their repeating geometric patterns required fewer master carvers than the old freeform designs. Echoes of this crisis resonate eerily today. When modern cathedrals like Barcelona's Sagrada Familia faced construction halts during recent global events, builders turned to digital modeling and prefabrication, 21st century solutions to the same age-old problem of disrupted labor. The difference: medieval masons left their adaptations visible, their struggles etched into the stone for us to decipher. Their legacy teaches us that architecture isn't just about vision, it's about resilience, about bending without breaking when the world itself seems to crumble. The plague may have ended Gothic's golden age, but in doing so, it gave us something equally profound, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of unimaginable loss. Imagine hauling a 2-ton block of limestone 200 feet into the air using nothing but rope, wood, and sheer human grit. That was the daily reality on a medieval construction site, where the humble treadwheel crane stood as the unsung hero of Gothic ambition. These towering wooden machines, often built right into the cathedral walls during construction, weren't just tools, they were feats of engineering in their own right. Picture a giant hamster wheel, but instead of a rodent, it's 2 burly laborers walking endlessly inside, their weight and momentum powering a pulley system that could hoist stones with precision rivaling modern machinery. Recent reconstructions by historians reveal just how sophisticated these cranes were. At Guidellon Castle, where experimental archaeologists are building a 13th century fortress using period techniques, a replica treadwheel crane demonstrated surprising efficiency. Operators could lift a 1-ton load nearly 40 feet in under a minute, comparable to some modern manual hoists. The secret lay in the gearing. A double-wheel design allowed teams to switch between speed and power modes depending on the load. Need to lift a delicate carved capital? Use the faster, lighter setting. Hauling up a massive foundation stone, engage the high torque mode by simply shifting the rope's attachment point. But raw mechanics tell only half the story. What truly made these cranes work was a carefully choreographed human symphony. Guild records from Canterbury describe a strict hierarchy among crane crews. The wheelers inside the treadwheel were often young apprentices building leg strength, while seasoned hookers guided loads with hand signals from below. The most critical role belonged to the rope dancer, a nimble specialist who scrambled up the scaffolding to free tangled lines mid-lift. One slip meant disaster. Accident reports from Vienna's Stephansdom mention a crushed foot when a rookie wheeler lost rhythm, causing a block to swing wildly. The real marvel wasn't the crane itself, but how it integrated into the construction ballet. At Chartres, archaeologists found grooves in the nave walls where cranes were temporarily anchored, moved, and re-anchored as work progressed. This wasn't haphazard, it followed a master plan still visible in the masonry patterns. Stones were pre-cut with lifting holes so the crane's tongs could grip them securely, a system so efficient that some blocks bear Roman numerals matching their planned placement. What modern engineers find most astonishing is the absence of safety margins. Medieval cranes operated at near maximum capacity daily, with no hydraulic buffers or emergency brakes. Yet failures were rare, not because the machines were infallible, but because human expertise compensated. Builders knew exactly how many wheel rotations were needed to raise a block to the 3rd course of the triforium, how to feather the descent by slightly reversing the wheel's motion. This wasn't just labor, it was a tactile dialogue between muscle and machine, where every creak of the rope and groan of the wood carried meaning, the ultimate testament to their skill. Many cathedrals still bear the marks of these cranes, not as scars, but as intentional features. The holes left by lifting beams were often repurposed as attachment points for scaffolding during repairs, creating a kind of architectural DNA that linked generations of builders. When the crane finally came down at a project's end, its components didn't go to waste. Timber became choir stalls, pulleys were reused in bell towers, and the ropes blessed by priests were woven into the very fabric of the cathedral's story. These machines weren't just tools, they were temporary collaborators in a centuries-long conversation between earth and sky. Step into the kaleidoscope of a Gothic cathedral's stained glass, and you're not just seeing colors, you're reading a luminous manuscript written in sunlight. These windows weren't mere decorations, they were medieval mass media, broadcasting sacred stories to congregations where few could read words but all could decipher symbols. The famous Poor Man's Bible at Canterbury Cathedral lays it bare. 3 tiers of lancets chart humanity's journey from creation to Judgment Day, each panel a chapter glowing with theological meaning. Adam and Eve's fall is rendered in ominous greens and grays, while Christ's resurrection explodes in gold so bright it casts dawn-like reflections on stone floors even on cloudy days. Rose windows took this storytelling to cosmic levels. Charter's North Rose isn't just pretty geometry, it's a carefully coded diagram of the universe as medieval scholars understood it. The 12 petals frame apostles, while outer circles spiral through prophets, kings, and angels, mirroring the celestial hierarchy. But here's the twist. The window's center doesn't show Christ as expected, but the Virgin Mary holding him. This was deliberate theology in glass, a visual argument for Mary's growing importance in 12th century worship, paid for by local guilds who venerated her as their patron. Color itself was language, the deep cobalt blue of Charter's windows, a shade so unique it's called Charter's blue, wasn't just beautiful, it symbolized divine wisdom. Red stood for Christ's sacrifice, green for hope and renewal, while ruby tones often marked scenes of martyrdom. Craftsmen achieved these hues through alchemical experimentation. Cobalt oxide for blue, copper compounds for red, crushed gold for that impossible celestial glow. The recipes were guild secrets so valuable that when the original glaziers of Burgess Cathedral died suddenly, their colors couldn't be replicated for centuries. Some narratives reveal surprising priorities. At Canterbury, the Thomas Becket window devotes an entire panel to the moment his killer's swords shattered on the cathedral floor. Not historically accurate, but a powerful visual claim about the church's inviolability. York Minster's 5 Sisters windows feature Old Testament heroines like Deborah and Judith far more prominently than male figures, likely funded by wealthy noblewomen. Even humor snuck in. The Fool's Window in Freiburg shows a jester balancing a church on his nose, a sly dig at bishops who overspent on construction. The true genius of these windows lies in their choreography with time. Architects positioned them so winter solstice light would illuminate nativity scenes, while summer rays set apocalyptic panels ablaze during harvest season. At St. Chapelle, the entire upper chapel becomes a jewel box when afternoon sun strikes, a deliberate metaphor for the heavenly Jerusalem. These weren't static images, they were celestial clocks, their meanings shifting with the sun's passage, turning sunlight into sermons and shadows into sacraments. Yet for all their sacred intent, the windows also preserved very human fingerprints. Glaziers often snuck self-portraits into corner foliage. Look closely at Lincoln Cathedral's Bishop's Eye window, and you'll spot a grinning face with a glass cutter's tools. Others left secret marks. A Canterbury pane shows a mason's compass hidden in a border's vine work, while a Strasbourg window includes a tiny demon, likely the glazier's revenge on a difficult patron. These personal touches remind us that while the stories were divine, the hands that told them were gloriously, rebelliously human, the most poignant lesson. These windows were designed to outlast their makers' lives. The craftsmen knew their names would fade, but their colors would keep preaching for centuries. As the light shifts through York Minster's great east window, the largest medieval stained glass expanse in England, each sunbeam becomes a voice from the past, still telling its story to anyone who cares to look up and listen. The moment a single chant echoed through the nave of a Gothic cathedral, something miraculous happened. The very stones seemed to join the choir. This wasn't accidental. It was acoustic engineering centuries ahead of its time. Medieval architects shaped space like master musicians tuning instruments, designing vaults to amplify sacred harmonies while silencing worldly distractions. Take the curved apse behind the altar. Its shell-like form wasn't just for show. When a priest spoke during Mass, those semicircular walls focused his voice outward, projecting Latin syllables with startling clarity to worshippers dozens of feet away. Even the ribbed vaulting overhead played its part. Those intricate ridges scattered sound waves in deliberate patterns, preventing echoes from muddying the sacred text. Choir stalls were strategically placed resonance chambers. At Westminster Abbey, the 14th century misericords, those flip-up wooden seats, were carved with hollow undersides to boost the bass tones of Gregorian chants. Meanwhile, the triforium galleries running along the upper walls served as acoustic baffles, breaking up sound waves that might otherwise create dissonant reverberations. Modern measurements at York Minster reveal how precisely this worked. A single voice singing "Amen" from the crossing can linger for nearly 8 seconds, yet remain intelligible rather than dissolving into noise. The real magic lay in the mathematics. Builders incorporated harmonic ratios into every dimension. The nave's length at Canterbury Cathedral equals exactly 5 times its width, a proportion that aligns with the musical intervals of a perfect fifth. This wasn't arbitrary. Medieval theorists believed these ratios mirrored the harmony of the spheres. The same mathematical relationships governing planetary orbits also shaped how sound traveled through sacred space. Even the materials were chosen for their sonic properties. The porous limestone of Chartres columns absorbs just enough high-frequency noise to prevent shrillness, while the polished marble floors reflect lower tones, creating a rich, enveloping soundscape. Some effects bordered on auditory illusion. The Whispering Gallery at St. Paul's Cathedral, where a murmur against one wall can be heard clearly across the dome, has medieval precedents. In Salamanca's old cathedral, a hidden passage beneath the choir stalls acts as a natural megaphone, allowing a speaker at the crypt entrance to be heard at the high altar as if standing beside it. These weren't parlor tricks, they were tools for making divine messages inescapable. Music itself was architecture in reverse. Composers like Perotin wrote polyphonic works specifically for Notre Dame's acoustics, knowing certain chords would trigger cascading echoes from the ambulatory chapels. The famous Notre Dame school of composers didn't just adapt to the building, they collaborated with it, treating the cathedral as the ultimate instrument. When modern ensembles attempt these pieces in concert halls, the music falls flat. It needs the cathedral's 7-second reverberation time to unfold properly, like a flower needing specific soil. The most poignant acoustic feature might be the intentional silences. Side chapels were often designed as sound shadows, shielded from the main nave's reverberations to provide spaces for private prayer. At Durham Cathedral, the thickness of the Norman pillars creates pockets where a whisper stays private despite the cavernous space. These quiet corners reveal the architect's deeper understanding that holiness lies not just in amplified glory, but in the spaces between the notes where the heart listens. Today's audio engineers still puzzle over how these pre-scientific builders achieved such precision. Laser scans of Ely Cathedral show that what appear to be decorative zigzags in the vaulting actually scatter sound waves at angles that prevent standing echoes. The lesson written in stone and air is clear. These weren't just buildings, they were resonant bodies, carefully tuned to lift human voices toward the divine, one perfectly calculated reflection at a time. Legends cling to the stones of Gothic cathedrals like ivy, twisting fact and fiction until the two become inseparable. Take Villard de Honnecourt, part architect, part medieval celebrity, part enigma. His famed sketchbook, filled with everything from precise cathedral plans to doodles of lions, made him the Leonardo da Vinci of the 13th century. But peel back the layers, and the real Villard might be even more fascinating than the myth. Recent parchment analysis reveals his sketches weren't the work of a single genius, but a collaborative guild workbook passed between master masons across Europe. Those travel notes in the margins, likely added by dozens of hands over decades, the legend of the lone visionary crumbles under scrutiny, revealing something far more revolutionary, a networked collective of anonymous innovators. Other builder saints of folklore prove equally slippery. There's William of Sense, the mastermind behind Canterbury Cathedral's choir, celebrated for surviving a near-fatal fall from scaffolding. Chronicles paint him as a martyr to his craft, directing repairs from his deathbed. But cathedral records tell a darker tale. His accident occurred after local laborers, resentful of his French origins, allegedly sabotaged the wooden supports. The truth, both stories likely contain seeds of reality. What gets remembered says more about what medieval society valued than what actually happened. A builder's death could be spun as pious sacrifice or divine punishment, depending on who controlled the narrative. Then there's the sinister flip side, architects recast as villains. Peter Parler, builder of Prague's St. Vitus Cathedral, was posthumously accused of witchcraft when his innovative net vaulting remained standing while godly, traditional designs collapsed. Rumors claimed he'd learned geometry from the devil, a trope echoing earlier tales of the mythical builder Solomon, who supposedly trapped demons to do his bidding. These weren't just spooky stories, they reflected real tensions between innovation and tradition. When technology seemed too advanced, supernatural explanations filled the gap. Why did legends eclipse facts? Start with the medieval equivalent of copyright. Guilds guarded trade secrets fiercely, leaving few written records. What survived were the stories patrons wanted told, like Bishop Fulbert's hagiography claiming Chartres Cathedral was rebuilt in 26 years through divine intervention. Archaeology says closer to 60. Miracles made better fundraising pitches than payroll receipts. Even the names we do know, like Eudes de Montreuil, who worked on Sainte-Chapelle, survived only because they appeared on royal expense reports, not as celebrated artists. The most enduring legends share a common thread. They transform technical mastery into moral allegory. The tale of the Cologne Cathedral architect who threw himself from the unfinished towers. Probably fiction, but it crystallized the very real peril and obsession of Gothic construction. The recurring motif of builders making Faustian bargains spoke to genuine awe. How could mere mortals achieve such wonders without otherworldly help? Perhaps the greatest myth of all is that these cathedrals sprang from individual genius rather than generations of collective labor. We've inherited the Renaissance's cult of the lone artist, projecting it backward onto a world that thought differently. The truth is messier, more democratic, and in some ways more beautiful. These monuments rose from countless hands, most now nameless, each contributing to something greater than themselves. The legends endure not because they're accurate, but because they let us touch the sublime through story, bridging the gap between earthbound reality and the heaven-straining aspirations these buildings embody. When flames tore through Notre Dame's attic in 2019, they exposed something unexpected: centuries-old masonry marks hidden beneath soot and plaster. As restoration teams carefully sifted through charred timbers, they uncovered not just damage, but a time capsule of medieval ingenuity. Laser scans revealed carpenters' signatures etched into oak beams, names like Hugo and Bertrand, carved alongside precise assembly instructions in 12th century French. These weren't random scratches, they were a masterclass in pre-industrial engineering, showing how each truss was numbered and fitted together like a giant puzzle before being hoisted into place. Modern technology is pulling back the curtain on even deeper secrets. At Canterbury Cathedral, ground-penetrating radar detected a network of hidden tunnels beneath the nave, not secret passages, but medieval stress relief channels designed to divert groundwater away from foundations. Similar scans at Chartres exposed iron reinforcements secretly embedded in its famous flying buttresses, proving Gothic architects used metal supports much earlier than previously believed. The biggest revelation, these weren't emergency fixes but planned features. The medieval builders anticipated stress points modern engineers only identify with computer models. Some discoveries rewrite history entirely. During Amiens Cathedral's restoration, archaeologists found traces of colored mortar in the upper vaults, a proof the entire interior was once vibrantly painted. What we consider the Gothic aesthetic, bare stone and filtered light, was originally a riot of reds, blues, and golds mimicking heavenly glory. Even more startling were the pigment's ingredients: crushed lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, Egyptian blue traded through Venice, and gold leaf so thin it floated on parchment before application. This wasn't just local craftsmanship, it was a medieval global supply chain. The real game changers are the digital reconstructions. By combining drone photogrammetry with 14th century workshop sketches, researchers at York Minster virtually disassembled its famous west window. The simulation showed how builders deliberately installed each panel slightly askew, not from error, but to compensate for centuries of settling. At Lincoln Cathedral, AI analysis of masons' marks revealed a sophisticated apprenticeship system, with junior workers progressing from simple base stones to intricate foliage carvings over decades. Perhaps the most humbling finds are the mistakes. Notre Dame's rubble contained chunks of failed mortar from its original construction quicklime that hadn't fully cured before application. Instead of hiding these flaws, medieval crews left them visible as warnings to future builders. Similar teaching moments appear at Beauvais, where cracks were carefully patched with distinctly colored stone, creating a permanent repair record. These weren't failures to conceal, but lessons to inherit. The ultimate revelation isn't about medieval techniques, but medieval thinking. As lasers map the exact curvature of each rib vault, a startling consistency emerges. From Paris to Prague, master builders adhered to geometric ratios within a 2% margin without standard measurements or central oversight. How? The answer lies in tracing floors recently uncovered at Strasbourg and Clermont-Ferrand. These full-scale stone blackboards allowed guilds across Europe to replicate designs exactly by pressing ropes into pre-scored lines. The first true international building code wasn't written on parchment, it was etched in plaster and shared through the feet of countless anonymous craftsmen. What began as disaster recovery has become a conversation across 8 centuries. Every time a modern conservator discovers a thumbprint in medieval mortar or a tool groove in a hidden joint, it's more than archaeology. It's a handshake between builders separated by time but united by craft. The stones are finally telling their stories, and what they reveal isn't just how these cathedrals were built, but why they endure, because their creators thought not in years, but in millennia. The same pollution that obscures our view of the stars is slowly eating away at the very stones of medieval cathedrals. Acid rain, a byproduct of modern industry, reacts with limestone surfaces, dissolving delicate carvings into ghostly outlines. At Milan Cathedral, restoration teams discovered that gargoyles eroded more in the last 50 years than in the previous 5 centuries combined. But the threat isn't just chemical, it's human. The footsteps of millions of tourists each year wear down floor stones that once seemed eternal, with Canterbury Cathedral's pilgrim path now requiring replacement every decade. Even the breath of visitors alters these spaces. The humidity from crowds has accelerated corrosion in the stained glass of Sainte-Chapelle, forcing conservators to install climate-controlled airlocks. Conservation teams face impossible choices daily. Traditional lime mortar, used for centuries, allows buildings to breathe but crumbles faster than modern cement. Do they preserve authenticity or longevity? At Chartres, the controversial decision to clean centuries of grime from the interior sparked global debate. Were those darkened walls merely dirt, or the accumulated patina of history itself? Similar dilemmas arise with reconstruction. When a storm destroyed the forest of wooden beams in Notre Dame's roof, engineers debated whether to replicate the original oak framework using medieval techniques or employ fireproof materials that would alter the cathedral's structural personality forever. Technology offers both solutions and complications. Laser cleaning can remove pollution crusts with micron precision, but risks stripping away original tool marks that tell the story of construction. Drones map erosion patterns invisible from the ground, yet their vibrations might destabilize fragile masonry. Even 3D printing presents ethical questions. When a vandal smashed the face of a Strasbourg cathedral apostle, conservators printed a replica from archival photos. Is it still medieval art if carved by a robot? The most insidious threat may be time itself. Medieval builders expected their structures to evolve. Cathedrals were palimpsests, constantly rewritten by each generation. But modern preservation often seeks to freeze them at a single moment. At Salisbury Cathedral, engineers installed nearly invisible carbon fiber rods to stabilize the leaning spire, sparking outcry from purists. Yet the original builders would likely have applauded. They routinely incorporated iron reinforcements where stone alone proved insufficient. Their pragmatism might be the greatest lesson for today. Preservation shouldn't mean petrification. Perhaps the answer lies in the medieval approach to repairs. When York Minster's masons replaced weathered statues in the 15th century, they didn't create perfect replicas. They carved new figures in contemporary styles, leaving a visible timeline of craftsmanship. At Lincoln Cathedral, restoration mortar is deliberately tinted slightly lighter than the original, creating a memory map of repairs for future generations. These buildings were never meant to be museum dioramas, but living conversations between past and present. The real challenge isn't just saving stones, but sustaining the spirit they embody, that fearless blend of reverence and innovation that allowed unknown architects to reach for the sky. As we clean their stained glass and reinforce their vaults, we must ask not just how to make them last, but what parts of their soul we dare to change. The greatest tribute we can offer these stone storytellers isn't perfect preservation, but the courage to continue their unfinished work, honoring the past while leaving room for futures we can't yet imagine. Medieval cathedrals whisper urgent lessons to our age of glass towers and carbon footprints, lessons about building not just for today, but for centuries unseen. Consider the radical sustainability of their material choices. Locally quarried limestone that breathes with humidity changes, timber harvested from managed forests that regrew over generations, even the reuse of Roman rubble as infill. These weren't eco-friendly gestures, they were necessity-driven innovations that created structures still standing after 800 winters. Modern architects marvel at how Chartres Cathedral's labyrinthine crypt passively regulates temperature year-round, or how Lincoln's lead-coated roofs were designed to be endlessly recast rather than replaced. The medieval mindset saw resources not as disposable, but as threads in an unbroken tapestry of use and renewal. Community was woven into every stone. Unlike today's star-charted culture, cathedral construction relied on hyper-local expertise: quarrymen who knew which limestone beds resisted frost, carpenters whose families had shaped oak for generations. The guild system wasn't just about quality control. It created lifelong bonds between craftsmen and their creations. At Wells Cathedral, masons left subtle variations in column capitals so apprentices could point out their grandfather's work decades later. This wasn't nostalgia, it was psychological ownership, ensuring each artisan treated their section as a legacy rather than a paycheck. Contemporary participatory design initiatives from Barcelona to Bangalore are rediscovering this wisdom, realizing that when communities literally leave their mark on buildings, they maintain them with greater care. Symbolism in medieval architecture functioned as a shared operating system. Every gargoyle, every rose window's petal count, even the alignment of doorways with solstice sunrises created layers of meaning accessible to both scholar and peasant. Today's buildings often communicate only through sterile glass facades or corporate branding, but forward-thinking firms are reviving symbolic storytelling. The Bosco Verticale in Milan doesn't just stack apartments, it transforms balconies into miniature forests echoing the city's lost woodlands. Norway's Svart Hotel mirrors the circular form of ancient Sami fishing huts while generating its own energy. Like Gothic builders encoding theology in geometry, these modern projects embed cultural memory and environmental ethics into their very bones, the most radical lesson. Medieval architects embraced incremental evolution. Salisbury Cathedral's spire was added a century after the nave, York Minster's windows updated over 300 years. This slow architecture accepted that great visions outlive individual lifespans, a stark contrast to today's rush for ribbon-cutting photo ops. When the Sagrada Familia's current architects study Antoni Gaudi's plaster models, they're continuing a medieval tradition where blueprints were living documents, not frozen commandments. Some contemporary collectives like Assemble Studio in London have adopted this approach, designing structures meant to morph with community needs, their unfinished edges inviting future hands to participate. Perhaps the deepest wisdom lies in their acceptance of imperfection. Medieval builders knew their stones would settle, their glass would fade, their ideals would be reinterpreted by generations unborn. At Canterbury, the Becket stone was deliberately left uncarved, a tactile reminder that only God creates perfection. In our era of parametric precision and airbrushed renders, this humility feels revolutionary. The cracks in Amiens' vaults, the slight warp in Chartres' labyrinth, these weren't failures, but proof that beauty and resilience often share the same imperfect foundation. As climate change demands architecture that adapts rather than dominates, these time-tested principles of flexibility, localism, and meaning may prove more vital than any smart glass or carbon fiber. The stones have been speaking for 800 years. It's time we listened. The soaring arches and intricate carvings of medieval cathedrals stand as silent witnesses to a radical truth. The greatest masterpieces in human history were often created by those whose names time has erased. These architects were more than mere builders. They were alchemists who transformed stone into theology, geometry into prayer. Their anonymity wasn't an oversight of history, but a testament to their deepest belief that true craftsmanship points beyond itself to something eternal. Consider the irony. Today we attach plaques to every modest civic building, Yet the minds behind Chartres, Canterbury, and Cologne remain shadows, but their absence speaks volumes. In an age obsessed with personal legacy, their silent stones challenge our modern cult of individualism. These master builders measured success not in fame, but in whether their work would outlive them by centuries, whether the light through their stained glass would still paint the same sacred stories long after their hands turned to dust. Their genius reveals itself in paradox. They worked within rigid guild systems yet innovated wildly. They bowed to ecclesiastical authority yet smuggled rebellious details into holy stone, a pagan green man here, a sly caricature there. They worshipped a god of order yet embraced the creative chaos of trial and error, learning as much from collapsed vaults as standing ones. Most strikingly, they balanced staggering ambition with profound humility, designing spaces meant to dwarf human scale, all while vanishing into the collective effort. The cathedrals themselves become their biographies. Study the wear patterns on York Minster's steps, grooves worn by generations of visitors, and you see architects who understood buildings aren't static objects but living companions to humanity's journey. Examine the subtle corrections in Notre Dame's facade, where later builders adjusted proportions based on their predecessors' miscalculations, and you witness a conversation across centuries. These weren't structures frozen in time, but evolving collaborations between the dead, the living, and the unborn. Perhaps their most enduring lesson is about the nature of true vision. Modern architects design for photographs and opening ceremonies. Medieval builders imagined how sunlight would filter through their windows in August versus December, how voices would carry during a whispered confession versus a chanted hymn, even how rainwater would cascade from gargoyles during a storm. Their mastery wasn't just spatial but temporal. They built for moments they would never live to see. So next time you enter a Gothic cathedral, don't just look up at the vaults, look closely at the joints between stones. Notice the subtle variations where one mason's chisel work transitions to another's. Run your fingers along the spiral stairs, feeling the slight unevenness where generations of builders adapted the design. These imperfections are their true signatures, not grand gestures, but quiet evidence of human hands striving toward the divine. The stones do whisper names if we learn to listen. Not in the way we expect, not carved plaques or historical records, but in the very fabric of these impossible buildings. Every time a buttress holds firm against a gale, every time colored light transforms a skeptic's face into wonder, every time a single note of plainsong resonates perfectly in the nave, the architects speak. Their legacy lies not in marble memorials, but in the way their work still lifts our gaze and our spirits towards something greater than ourselves. Now it's your turn. Have you discovered a hidden detail in your favorite cathedral? Maybe a mason's mark tucked into a corner, or sunlight hitting a particular window at just the right moment. Share your stories below, and let's keep these anonymous masters' memories alive. For more journeys into the forgotten corners of history, subscribe and join us as we keep uncovering the remarkable stories written in stone.